Hey everybody, day 3 here. I hope you're still doing all right. Quick review. So we've covered kind of the purpose of these cars, the general execution of them, and yesterday was kind of some regressions and some blocks to try to start tackling some of the compensations or issues that you're running into. So I just want to reaffirm kind of the purpose of these, that we're really trying to help our nervous system basically map out the joint. So really showing it kind of where the end range is and where it should feel comfortable. They're really good for, just waking up in the morning and setting the tone for where you can move, for maintaining all the mobility that you currently have. And throughout the process of doing these and learning them, really gaining kind of more appreciation for controlling your body. We typically ask ourselves to kind of squat some extra weight, when in reality we're probably not able to fully control that hip joint. So throwing weight on top of a pair of hips that can't really control themselves well doesn't really make sense. So hopefully you're starting to appreciate being able to just control your body on its own before even loading it up. So through the course of this quarantine, we'll continue to work the hips and some different joints, and hopefully when we come out of it, you'll be that much more prepared and ready to go to load up some of those exercises. So shifting on from the cars a little bit. So the kind of the main guy who came up with all this likes to saying, you can't move where you can't move. So if you get really good at your hip car and you push it to the end range in every angle and every direction, once you've kind of mastered that, you can't move any further than that. If the soft tissue is what's kind of preventing any further movement, continuing to do these cars is great for maintaining mobility, but it can't add any more to that. The soft tissue is the limitation. So today we're going to get into, well, how do we manipulate the soft tissue to allow you for some more movement? So what we're going to do with this is they're called PAILs and RAILs. So progressive and regressive angular isometric loading. It's not important for you to really know, but a couple things in there. Progressive and regressive just talks about two different tissues. Kind of think about front and back, left and right, internal, external rotation. So we're going to be working kind of both sides of a joint for these. Angular, we're typically going to be working in a rotational way. So you can also do these flexion extension, front to back, left to right. But we're going to be angularly loading our joints. And isometric, that means we're not going to be moving anything. So for those of you who have done these with me before, you know that you're just pressing into the floor or pushing into a wall, pushing into a box. You're not moving. Part of the reason for the isometric is it really forces your body to kind of create as much tension as possible. So if you have to pick up something that's a couple pounds, your brain recognizes that right away and goes, I don't need to fire all my motor units. The whole muscle doesn't need to work because it's light. When you're working isometric and pressing the floor, you're not going to move the floor. So all of a sudden that nervous system kicks on and decides, I need to use everything I can. So when we're doing these PAILs and RAILs, it needs to be pretty aggressive and pretty active. You're trying to get as much tissue as you can to create tension. While we're kind of doing these, I'm going to talk through the hip PAILs and RAILs, but keep some of those points in mind. Last thing, so as we start talking about kind of creating more room in the tissue, another little saying that you've all heard, if you don't use it, you lose it. So, you look at kind of younger kids or people that are still very mobile, and they have all this space available in the joints because they've continued to move through it. Most of us have kind of stopped from the PE days or the sports that we used to do or the activities that we used to do, and our nervous system kind of responds accordingly. When we don't use that range of motion, it no longer feels comfortable, so it starts to kind of tighten things down. I made a little visual aid for you here. I used what we had available. We've stocked up well on wine. So here is kind of a nice young joint capsule. Let's call this the femur, and this kind of the tibia fibia, so upper leg, lower leg. So this joint capsule is nice and loose. There's a ton of space available for those bones to work off of each other. right? So this is the younger people, the people that still have a ton of range of movement. As that joint capsule tightens, there's no range here left. The capsule's kind of shrunk down, and now all of a sudden you just can't move as well. Everything feels stiff, you lose internal rotation on the hips, whatever it may be. So that's what's happening as you kind of lose range of motion. That connective tissue layer that surrounds the joint, it really prevents good movement between the two bones there. So kind of visualize that as we're going through this stuff. So first thing I want to do, I want to get some CARs done. Make sure that I kind of map out my joints for my brain, and then we'll get to the PAILs and RAILs. So one thing I want you to do before you do PAILs and RAILs, I want you to do 2 CARs each direction, each leg, and I want you to focus this time on pretty slow controlled movement. So the more comfortable you get with these, kind of the slower and almost more difficult they should look, because you're really squeezing every degree and every inch on it. So I'm going to go ahead now. Thinking about when do I let go, when do I activate the opposite direction, trying to keep my inside glute and quad stiff. I'm grabbing onto the door frame and using that to brace the entire inside of my body. So for time's sake, I'm just going to do 1 on each side. Same thing over here. I run out of room into adduction. I activate external rotation. When I run out, I activate into internal. Staying tall, inside leg stiff. And I'll finish the rep coming back around. Good. All right, so CARs are done. Now we're going to go ahead to our PAILs and RAILs here. So for PAILs and RAILs, what we want to do is we want to basically find the end range of motion that our joints are comfortable with, and then we're going to do some work from there. So if you think about it, most of the stuff that we kind of think of as exercise is done in the middle of that range of motion. We're trying to put our joints at the end of their range, kind of where they're barely comfortable, and then put some work in there. Our nervous system kind of listens to that and decides, okay, this new range is safe. So for hips, we're going to be in 90-90, meaning my front hip is at 90 with my knee and ankle. Back hip is at 90 with my knee and ankle. First things I'll say, if you feel really uncomfortable, not kind of like, oh, I feel a stretch. If you feel really uncomfortable, think about a yoga block or some pillows to basically boost your hips up. On one of my legs, my knee feels a little torqued in front, so I'll boost the hip up or I'll put something underneath the knee. Same thing for the back leg. You can boost the hip up, boost the knee up, change the angle a little bit of your foot and ankle. Get yourself decently comfortable here. Tomorrow I'm going to go through a few more kind of corrections and things you can do to try to help yourself out. Today I just want to get to the basics. So first things first, when we're working the front hip, we're in external rotation. So I'm going to find the limit where I start to feel a stretch. So for this, the first part here, I'm going to switch up. So I want you to think about, I'm not trying to stretch by leaning forward. That does nothing for this hip here. That finds a stretch by stretching out my upper back. I want to find a stretch by thinking about driving my hips back and pushing my chest forward. One other thing to think about there, when I drive this front hip back, I want to bring the opposite hip forward. So press forward with the opposite hip, drive back with the target hip. That'll give you a really good stretch right in the back of the glute. So we're looking for a stretch somewhere right back in here. So I drive my left hip back, my target hip, the opposite hip presses forward with my chest. When you start to feel a bit of a stretch, we're going to hold on to that for 2 minutes. I'm not going to do that here, but all you're going to do is breathe into it, hold your posture. It's going to take a while. I don't want you to get lazy. We need this 2-minute stretch in the glute because any stretch under about 2 or 1 minutes doesn't get recognized by the nervous system. So this stretch isn't for the purpose of actually lengthening tissue. This stretch is for the purpose of your nervous system finally picking up on, oh hey, Steve's got something going on in that hip, I'm going to pay attention. If you don't hold that for at least 2 minutes, it just kind of goes away. The nervous system doesn't even realize you're trying to work. So we're going to hold our stretch for 2 minutes. Get some good breathing. Hold on to that good stretch. After 2 minutes, here's the push and pull portion. So for this front hip, I'm going to pretend there's a scale underneath this front foot. I'm going to brace my body, push into the ground with my arms, start ramping up some tension onto that scale. So I'm going to press as hard as I feel comfortable. For the first couple times you do this, maybe think 50% of kind of max effort. Start ramping up more and more the more you do it. So I'm going to press down into the floor just with this foot. I'm trying to think about swinging my leg, pendulum my leg down through the floor. So you'll feel the glute working in front. 15 seconds. After 15, now I'm going to pull. So I'm going to think about trying to lift this foot up. I'm going to drive my hip back and pull my chest forward. So we want you to feel a little bit more stretch in this back hip. I want you to envision that joint capsule that we used wine bottles for. I want you to feel that joint capsule opening up. Again, it's not about just trying to lean forward. It's about trying to drive the hip back, push the chest forward, and get a little deeper into the ball and socket back here. So 2-minute stretch, 15 seconds push, 15 seconds pull. Do that 15 and 15 for 2 rounds. You only need to stretch 1 time at the beginning. So for the back hip, now we're in internal rotation here. So this stretch is a little bit different. Now we're just going to open up your body, lean into it a little bit, play around with where you need to lean and move and angle to try to find a stretch really deep into the joint here. So this first front hip was a little more kind of, you'll feel soft tissue stretching. This is a little deeper and you'll feel more of kind of a capsule stretch in there. So I'm going to find that good stretch for me. I'm going to hang out for 2 minutes. Now I'll do my 2 rounds of 15 and 15. So for the push round, I'm thinking that same scale idea. I'm going to press down into the floor just with the back foot. Again, I'll feel the glute turning on. Press the ground with my hands, push, push, push. Now the pull part. I need to lean forward a little bit. You're all going to be a little bit different. If I don't lean, I really can't get a ton of movement. I'm going to lean a little bit, just enough to get this foot up. And I'm trying to drive rotation in this hip. So I always ask people to check kind of their lower back and right above their pelvis, because they're generally substituting some hip hike for internal rotation. So it helps me to think about driving my knee, my leg into the floor, pull that foot up, and drive internal rotation into this hip. Then I'll relax. One good tip I like for the internal rotation portion. After 1 round of 15-15, I want you to grab onto your shin. I want you to reach that leg out and try to get this hip to drop towards the floor a little bit. So from the side, I do my 15-15. I'm going to grab on, I'm going to reach out, try to close the gap down between my leg and the floor. Then I'll repeat 15 press, 15 pull. All right, so that's the basis of PAILs and RAILs. So cars are great. Do them at least once a day. They're going to maintain everything you have and build some bodily awareness. But once we get into PAILs and RAILs, that's when we're actually able to start opening up new space. I like to generally do some just body weight squats or lunges right after, just to kind of use that space in action a little bit. So towards the end of the hip series, I'll get into kind of some exercises and ways of thinking to use that new space. But for now, just focus on the PAILs and RAILs, and I'll be back tomorrow with some tips and pointers on how to kind of individualize those for you. Thanks.